So this here is probably the least popular intuitive type. For whatever reason, when people consider what type they might be, ENFJ tends to get bypassed. And there's actually a good reason for this. Not many actual ENFJs would relate to what is typically described in ENFJ type descriptions. You know, the kind of altruistic paladin on the front lines of social reformation. Kind of ironic, seeing as how ENFJs tend to be the most naturally private and reserved out of all of the extroverted types. So this video is going to expand on all this and more in order to give you 5 signs that you may actually be an ENFJ. And as a prelude to the video, it's important first of all to bear in mind that the ENFJ is a cognitive extrovert rather than cognitive introvert, and therefore tend to stay in a predominantly cognitive reactive state rather than a proactive one. And this is not to say they're not behaviourally proactive types, of course. Many ENFJs have extremely high initiative, for example. But in terms of cognition itself, the type does not employ introversion as much for its own sake. And the type tends to feel most alive when they are actively engaging with external reality. And whether they find that reality draining is another thing altogether. So first let us start with the biggest sign that you are an ENFJ, FeSe Dominance. That is extroverted feeling, extroverted sensing. We need first and foremost to address the elephant in the room. Being an extroverted feeling dominant is completely and utterly misunderstood, to the point of being, in my opinion, the single most exaggerated cognitive trait, so to speak, out of them all. Even more so than introverted sensing dominance, and you know how I feel about that. Being an Fe dominant does not equate to being the life and soul of a party, or some kind of fluffy teddy bear giving everyone hugs. Instead, Fe dominants tend to be pretty serious or even reserved people. It actually takes a little bit of work to get them to loosen up a bit, especially the ENFJ. I mean, sure, a small minority of ENFJs live up to the stereotype of, constantly Fe harmonizing and bringing communities together, but most do not. To be an Fe dominant more concerns a kind of orderly attunement to the interpersonal landscape and one's place within it. Unlike the Fe agency types, that is ENTP and ESTP, ENFJs tend not to view the social world as a kind of playground, but rather something entirely more serious and scary that needs active management to ensure that it does not collapse. And another thing people tend to misunderstand about this dominant focal point is fluffiness, or lack thereof. Fe dominants can even be more blunt with their friends and loved ones than Ti dominants, who can actually seem pretty chill and live and let live by comparison. The only difference is the communication style tends to be a little bit more passive with the Fe dominant. As a humorous aside, you could argue that Ti dominants are kind of do your own thing so long as you don't get in my way, whereas extroverted feeling dominants may just be don't do your own thing. Fe dominants in general tend to have deeply internalized senses of correctness, and when someone is out of line, they tend to let that person know about it. And more unhealthy Fe dominants can actually be pretty draconian in this sense. And here extroverted feeling is paired to the small and refined lens of extroverted sensing, and therefore concerns a smaller portion of the external landscape. Essentially here, breadth of social connection is traded for depth of social connection. If anything is off with you, an ENFJ will tend to sense it, and they will probably worry a lot. Maximal social harmony with a close-knit group of friends and loved ones tends to be a priority for this type. And maintaining a larger circle of acquaintances can actually be very difficult for this type, as they tend to lack the social energies necessary in order to engage FENE in that ESFJ kind of way. But when we blend in the natural sensitivity of this FeSe pairing, it gets even more difficult. ENFJs take criticism hard, and the first person they look to blame when things go wrong is, of course, themselves, which makes it all the more painful. With FeSe in dominant position, this pairing essentially acts as a gateway to FiSi, that is introverted feeling, introverted sensing. Ergo, it is when an ENFJ interacts with other people that they feel their introverted feeling the strongest. Absent social settings, they can actually feel more detached and cool in a landscape. And so it follows when criticized by people around them, introverted feeling will feel it very strongly. One of the silver linings here is in their natural co-regulatory abilities. Just talking it out with a friend and having the space to express their emotions in a socially harmonious environment goes a long way for this type. after all allowing FeSe to access FiSi and directly consolidate via the impression gateway. And this can allow rough emotions to essentially blow through this type, especially when they have other people to co-regulate with. And in order to essentially protect their introverted feeling from criticism, ENFJs often strive to embody a kind of perfect, inoffensive image. But ultimately it comes down to making the correct decisions. Having the correct moral values, for example, having the correct logical deduction or insight, having the correct answer to a question, or even having the correct vocation. And this brings us to the following point. In order to protect their more vulnerable FiSi, introverted thinking and introverted intuition kick in order to systemize a correct way of being. And of course, as an FE dominant, this first and foremost applies to social skill sets. ENFJs will often be adept at saying the right thing at the right time, and can be extraordinarily affirming of others. I'd say lifting people up is one of the fortes of this type. But TiNi goes far beyond this type's social prowess. Within the introverted thinking of the ENFJ, adjoined as it is to an introverted intuitive codec, things internally have to make sense. On a global NI scale, I might add. And this is one of the reasons this type tends to be, more than other types, read up on politics, philosophy, economics, etc. Not just having their own viewpoints, but often even more so, being actively knowledgeable of all of the relevant schools of thought within those areas. Because such knowledge gives this type a certain sense of knowledgeable certainty, and a kind of holistic bedrock upon which external interaction can commence. And one thing that really gets misunderstood about the TiNi of the ENFJ is its highly concrete nature. This isn't to say that ENFJs do not have an abstract side, but oftentimes they keep that side of themselves hidden, private even. So private that it may not even come out in their closest relationships. And this in many ways can be explained by the nature of the attitudes within CPT. For all of the abstraction of the process itself, the actual purpose of the process oftentimes within this particular cognitive network is to lay a kind of foundation for tangible external interaction. Furthermore, the holistic frameworks of the ENFJ can apply as much to, or perhaps even more, to economics, project management, marketing, etc., as philosophy, spirituality, moral frameworking. And ENFJs tend to have a system for anything that they are invested in. This is a highly systematic type. If they're into home decor, there'll be a system for that. They may be even into feng shui, for example. If they're into human resource management, they'll have a highly systematic way of dealing with the issues. Within the TiNi of the ENFJ, there is often a right and correct time for everything. And beneath the oftentimes warm demeanour of this type is a calculating interior, forming multiple contingencies together into a single cohesive system. Sign number 3 that you might be an ENFJ, the introverted thinking oppositional function. You see, the caveat of this highly orderly, reliable and locked in introverted thinking comes with its hyperdivergent attitude. The onus is much more upon observing an otherwise static introverted thinking than acting upon it in a creative manner. As such, this type does tend to be a little bit mistake avoidant. Again, the onus is upon doing the correct thing in the correct way at the correct time, much more than it is upon bashing yourself against external reality or indeed internal reality just to see what happens and what might fit. And in regards to introverted thinking, rather than embracing a more chaotic, theoretical, exploratory style, the Ti of the ENFJ wants to get it right. And therefore they will tend to prioritize trusted sources of information. Generally, the emphasis is less upon the lively discovery of new perspectives, and more upon the correction of irrational perspectives, or worse yet, perspectives that are dangerous. Focusing upon the dominant function alone, people miss a whole other world of the ENFJ, the side of themselves that tends to take very little BS from other people. If something is illogical, isn't making sense, ENFJs are a good type to point it out. And generally ENFJs are very happy to correct the behaviour or even worldview of other people, based entirely upon its logical, or lack thereof, merit. People tend to highly underestimate the side of the ENFJ which really does operate from logic and practicality, pragmatism alone. And again, while many ENFJs do share their more abstract and existential side, many, I'd even argue most, do not. And I would add particularly within the more extroverted of ENFJ subtypes, the convergent subtype and the glider subtype, those who take more ownership over their extroverted functions than their introverted ones. In such cognitive settings, existential matters may simply not be as much of a concern. People tend to estimate just how sensory the more extroverted variants of this type can be. So, sign number 4 that you may be an ENFJ, the introverted intuitive authority function. And this need for internal cohesion, a certain level of making sense, applies to the future visions of this type as well. And out of all of the extroverts, I would say it is the ENFJ who takes the most security from a sense of continuity over time, a sense of knowing where they are going. And as an interesting contrast, in the short term, their extroverted sensing agency function can happily take over and play. But the NA authority function must also be satiated before the SE agency can be kind of let off the reins. But when it comes to the long term, rather than the short term, this type is very much concerned with where they are going. It's quite interesting actually, because the vision can concern milestones, places that the type will arrive at. But the actual means by which the type can get there can often be a source of play, because essentially this NI vision scaffold within an introverted thinking framework can put a type prone to perfectionism and worry at ease. And the future is often the means by which the ENFJ regulates anxiety. But I would say this trait doesn't seem to apply so much to divergent variants of the ENFJ. When you scale up introversion within this type, they do become a lot more exploratory and happy to just see what happens. But when you scale up extroversion, this kind of TI bedrock, the certainty of the NI vision, becomes all the more important. The less the ENFJ is actively exploring their inner world, the more they want to make sure that internal world aligns with external reality. That being said, while divergent ENFJs can be a bit more easygoing, they do still have that need to know attitude. So while this point applies a little bit more to the extroverted variants of the ENFJ, it is far too important a point to pass up in this video, especially seeing as so many ENFJs, albeit they seem to be a little bit more outside of the typological world, are extroverts. That is, types who take more ownership over the extroverted functions than the introverted ones. I'd say given sufficient NI confidence and drive, the TE of this type can be downright prodigious. Seriously, back before my CPT days, I actually mistyped a lot of people who were ENFJs as ESTJs because of that insane TENE employment. But rather than being tied to a very specific and nuanced focal point of SE, the lens by which ENFJ exacts TE into external reality is a much more holistic and generalistic extroverted intuition. And this makes for a type with a wide breadth of external control, and one therefore able to take a lot of responsibility on their shoulders. And the aforementioned TiNi Systemisation highly complements this ability. ENFJs often seem to be in management positions and often excel particularly well within project management. When there are many components that have to be brought together at the perfect time, the TENE of the ENFJ, backed up after all by their TiNi divergence, can be even more effective than that of the ESTJ themselves. This is because by contrast, the ESTJ tends to embrace more improvisational side. They don't tend to need to know in a kind of exactitude in the same way ENFJs do. And therefore, while both types use TENE, they do so with a very different kind of attitude. And the caveat of the ENFJ still acquiring this TiNi bedrock of certainty before they can enact TENE lies in their strong aversion to improvisation and potential lack of opportunism by comparison. They do not embrace the extrovert intuitive world in the same way that the ESTJ does, despite using the same extroverted thinking pairing. What they will do, however, is kind of cement themselves into a position of responsibility. Responsibility, I might add, that is often socially relevant. Precisely TiNi systemizing a kind of cause and effect, and expertly juggling oftentimes pretty intense workloads to bring results. Bonus point, the introverted thinking, introverted sensing blind spot. So in CPT, there's technically no such thing as the SI blind spot. This is because functions are only functional when they are paired together. A codec, a judging function, cannot enact any kind of rationality if it cannot see what it wants to rationalize upon. And similarly, a lens, a perceiving function, cannot perform any rationalization of its own. It requires an adjoining codec in order to do so. So when it comes to FeSe, that is introverted sensing paired to introverted feeling, the ENFJ is one who is highly attuned to their personal sense of values and convictions, a concrete sense of self. This pairing is far from blind. When it comes to TiSi, however, introverted thinking, introverted sensing, the TiNi of this type is often so obstinate as to make it very difficult for TiSi to get a word in. And when they do so, it often creates feelings of overwhelm within their psyche. Details, sequences, complex mechanisms, such things can be the bane of this type. And getting to grips with them without defaulting to holistic principles, ignoring them entirely or relying upon other people for help, can be a growth point for this type. A growth point, I might add, that I've seen a lot of ENFJs develop. But the take home, don't give this type a computer. That was a joke, of course. Definitely give the type a computer, just encourage them to understand its inner workings on a more complex level. I do actually know one ENFJ software engineer, which is an interesting combination. And it just shows you shouldn't use type to determine what you do. And you might just find a different kind of vocation might develop your cognition in a different direction. And going back to the point that talked about TiNi Systemisation, the learning style of the ENFJ often uses scaffolding techniques in order to connect something new to something already known via association. But there can sometimes be the caveat here of forced association, when two things that are not truly the same are kind of generalized into one single unit. But as a result of all of this, rote memorization, just cramming information into your head, can suffer. I wouldn't say there's any type that's particularly gifted at rote memorization, but TiSi Blindspot types can have a bit of a harder time with it. And there is another interesting ramification of the TiSi Blindspot within this type. Remember that I said ENFJs are highly systematic for as long as they care about something. Well, when something is not relevant to the TiNi vision of the ENFJ, this can actually ensue a kind of double life. At the workplace, the ENFJ might be the epitome of conscientiousness, for example. But in a domestic environment, partially due to a possible absence of FE scrutiny, they may actually be a lot less orderly than they are in the workplace. They may even be a complete slob, who knows? It wouldn't tend to work vice versa, of course, because being seen by others tends to activate the conscientiousness of this type, to maintain a reputation and such things. But it is important to bear in mind that just because someone appears systematic and conscientious in one way, in one setting, this does not mean it'll apply to every corner of their life. And this is a big caveat of using typology in general to understand people, because there's a lot of it depends to the entire thing. As many of you know, my own research interest is more into dynamic systems and assessing people between multiple different situations and contexts in order to get the full scope of their personality, rather than the mean across time, for example. People are a lot more dynamic than a kind of 4x4 matrix would make you believe. So that concludes the video. I hope it's been informative, and if you know anyone who you think might be an ENFJ, be sure to share it with them. If you're interested in learning more about the fundamentals of CPT, I recommend checking out the CPT ebook. And if you're interested in what your type might be, I also offer typing services at cognitivepersonality.com. And you can also check out coaching services over there as well. And if you would like to support the theory in the channel on that additional level, I recommend checking out the CPT Patreon. So that's it for me, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks. For now, take care.